I sometimes reflect on how I missed the early signs. Owning a small martial arts studio where I teach self-defense has always been a source of pride for me. It may not make me wealthy, but it brings me fulfillment knowing I'm helping others gain the skills to protect themselves. My wife, on the other hand, works in corporate finance. For years, I thought our marriage was solid. But everything started to shift about 6 months ago. The first clue was her sudden obsession with her appearance. She began hitting the gym 5 days a week and revamping her wardrobe. At first, I supported her. After all, everyone deserves to feel good about themselves. But soon, other changes crept in. Her phone became an extension of her hand. We'd always shared our phones for simple things like checking the weather or snapping pictures. But now, her phone was always face down and locked. If I needed it for anything, she'd insist I use mine instead. Then came the late nights at work. More frequent and stretching longer than ever. She began taking more business trips, citing new client meetings and strategy sessions. When she was home, the connection between us felt strained. She stopped initiating intimacy, and when I tried, her response was either to claim exhaustion or go through the motions without enthusiasm. I asked her what was going on, but she insisted it was just work stress and fatigue from her intense workouts. She promised things would improve, but they didn't. In fact, they only worsened. There was a senior manager at her office she often mentioned in her stories. He had an MBA from a prestigious school and earned far more than I probably ever would. I'd met him a few times at company events, but he barely acknowledged me. Then, suddenly, she stopped talking about him altogether, even though I knew they were still working closely together. The tipping point came when she went on a business trip to Miami with him and their CEO. Something about that trip didn't sit well with me. My friend Marcus, who works in IT, suggested I start looking into things discreetly, but I felt uncomfortable snooping. We had 2 kids, and the thought of potentially unraveling our family over something that might be insignificant felt absurd. Yet, the doubt gnawed at me. After weeks of internal conflict, I finally decided to check our phone records. What I found shook me to my core. Hundreds of late-night texts to a single number. I called the number from a payphone, and when the voicemail picked up, I heard his voice. The final straw came the next morning when, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. The text history with his number had been deleted, and his contact was saved under a woman's name. That's when I knew my suspicions weren't unfounded. I began paying closer attention. She started getting up in the middle of the night, claiming she couldn't sleep, but would always take her phone into another room. Marcus kept advising me to gather more evidence, but every time I thought of that Miami trip, I felt sick. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I pretended to fall asleep but stayed awake. Around midnight, she got up and headed to the living room. I waited a few minutes, then followed her quietly. There she was, sitting on the couch, texting with a small smile on her face. I walked in casually and said, "I can't sleep either." She jumped and tried to hide her phone, her reaction telling me everything I needed to know. I stayed calm and began being playful, trying to get her in the mood. As expected, she made an excuse. That's when I made my move. Pretending to be playful, I grabbed her phone. The last text I saw before she snatched it back read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." I hit the call button, and when a man's voice answered, it became undeniable. I hung up, read the texts aloud, and watched her face crumble. She immediately tried to justify herself, saying they were just friends, and he was having problems with his wife. But when I mentioned the late-night texts, she broke down and admitted to the flirting but swore nothing physical had occurred. I told her to pack a bag and go to her mom's place. We'd talk when I was ready. She left that night, crying and asking if this meant we were done. I told her I needed time to think. The next few days were a blur of pain and confusion. My phone was silent, turned off, as I needed space to process everything. She kept trying to reach out, texting, calling, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I needed time away from the chaos. Marcus, who had gone through something similar, became my lifeline. He helped me find a divorce lawyer who was not only experienced but also willing to work with me on fees. Given my wife was the primary breadwinner, This was a relief I couldn't have anticipated. When we finally spoke, the truth came out. She admitted the affair, which had started around the time she began going to the gym. They'd gotten physical about 4 months ago, right when she stopped being intimate with me. Hearing the raw details felt like a gut punch, worse than I had ever imagined. The betrayal stung more deeply than I thought I was prepared for. The lawyer recommended that I stay in the house with the kids while she moved into her mother's place. It was a strategic move, one that would help with custody later. I didn't tell her I was filing for divorce. He advised it was better that she found out when the papers were served. During this time, I threw myself into my work at the studio. Teaching self-defense gave me purpose and a brief escape from the constant turmoil in my mind. But at night, when the kids were asleep, the quiet allowed my thoughts to flood in. I couldn't shake the images, the idea of her and him laughing at me, mocking me for not having a college degree. It haunted me like a cruel echo of all the things I had believed in. I had used to spend hours reading history, science, anything to feed my mind. Now, the pages felt foreign, impossible to focus on. Surprisingly, people began to rally around me. Students at the studio, parents, even some of her friends who learned the truth, reached out in support. Some of them even suggested I move on and date again, but I wasn't ready. I needed to focus on my kids and getting through the divorce first. News spread at her office too. Her affair partner, presumably worried about his own marriage, lost interest. She, on the other hand, started spiraling, drinking too much, going out to bars, and her best friend informed me she had been meeting random men online. Every time I saw her for the kids' exchanges, she looked worse, like she had aged years in a matter of months. There were moments when I felt pity for her, but then I would remember the pain she had caused. The path ahead was long and painful, but I was determined to rebuild, for myself and for my children. The divorce progressed quickly once the papers were filed. Initially, she fought it, but when her lawyer explained that she'd have to pay me support, given that she earned more, her attitude shifted. Anger replaced the sorrow, and she started calling me a gold digger. It was like she had become someone completely different from the woman I had once shared my life with for 15 years. We settled on 50-50 custody of the kids. The first few months were the hardest. Every time they weren't with me, the house felt empty, devoid of meaning. I would find myself sitting in their rooms, surrounded by their toys and belongings, counting down the hours until they returned. The studio began picking up again, but just as quickly, everything came to a halt when COVID hit. With more time at home, I took on the majority of the remote schooling for the kids. Then came the woman I met at a barbecue. She was heading to Europe for work, but we kept in touch, initially as friends. Our conversations about books, movies, and random thoughts were a breath of fresh air. It was nice talking to someone who didn't see me as just the man whose wife had cheated on him. Meanwhile, my ex-wife's world was crumbling. I heard from a friend that she was taking on extra work, trying to make ends meet while covering the costs of her new apartment and support payments. Her drinking problem worsened, and she began showing up late for pickups, looking disheveled, exhausted, and sometimes crying, lamenting about how she missed our old life. When my friend returned from Europe, we started spending more time together. She was intelligent without being overbearing, successful but grounded. At first, I worried about the age gap, but that concern quickly faded. She was easy to talk to, and my kids adored her, which meant everything to me. When my ex found out I was dating, she reacted badly, spreading rumors that I must have cheated too, claiming that no one could move on so quickly without someone waiting in the wings. But those who truly knew me understood. They saw how hard I worked to keep everything stable for our kids, and how I didn't date anyone for almost a year after our separation. Looking back, I'm grateful I didn't try to salvage the marriage. A friend later told me that my ex had never believed I would actually leave. She thought I was so dependent on her money and status that I'd forgive anything to keep our life intact. Realizing she was wrong broke something in her. These days, life is good. My girlfriend practically lives at my place now, working from home and helping with the kids' homework while I'm teaching at the studio. We've talked about marriage, but there's no rush. The kids are doing better, though they still have tough moments, especially when it comes to their mom. But they're adjusting. I found new hobbies too. My girlfriend introduced me to photography, and now I create little videos of my students' tournaments. It's a creative outlet that gives me something to focus on when the kids are with their mom. If I could give advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this. Keep moving forward. Progress might be slow, some days it might feel like an inch at a time, but that's okay. Focus on doing one small thing each day to improve your life. Learn something new, try something different. The pain doesn't vanish, but with time it becomes smaller. As for my ex, she still hasn't found her footing. The last time I saw her, she looked much older than her years. A friend mentioned she's still drinking too much, trying to reclaim the life she lost. Occasionally I feel sorry for her, but I remind myself it's the result of her own choices. All I can do now is focus on building a life that's good for me and my kids. Strange how life works. 3 years ago I thought my world was ending. But now I'm happier than I've been in years. Not because everything is perfect, but because I've learned who I am, what truly matters, and that's worth far more than money or status.